Hello, this is Rick Jordan, the Church Resources Coordinator for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. I want to welcome you to this webinar on a Muslim American's Reflections of a Post-9/11 America. Presenter today is Naijla Faizi. For the last year, Naijla has been the Director of Muslim Life Programming at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Naijla is a Southerner to her core. She grew up in North Carolina, where she often carried the burden of being the only Muslim that her friends and local community had ever met. At Wake Forest University, Naijla and the Muslim community were confronted with a variety of challenges, including an Islamophobia hate campaign against their Muslim chaplain. In their struggle to look beyond the overwhelming pressure of constantly exonerating their deepest sense of self from accusations of violence and savagery and oppression, Naijla was inspired by a simple Quranic teaching: let not the hatred of a people swerve you away from justice. Naijla will share personal narratives about navigating the complexities of her lived experience as a Muslim in the South and at Wake Forest following the events of 9/11. Today's presentation will begin with Naijla's presentation, and if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, you can scroll to the bottom of your screen where there is a question answer box. You click on that and you can type in your question or comment. You can do that at any time, and it will be at the end of the presentation that I will ask Naijla of those questions you might have presented to us. In addition to the questions, there could be some opportunity for some brief participation among the participants via chat box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be put on the virtual resource library of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship North Carolina website. Naijla, we welcome you, and before you begin your presentation, please tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. As you said, I'm a Southerner. I was born and raised in North Carolina. My family immigrated to the U.S. from Pakistan, which is in between India and Bangladesh. My father came to the U.S. for college. He went to Davidson College, which is pretty close by to where I live in Winston-Salem, and my family has just stayed in North Carolina ever since. My grandfather was a professor at High Point University back when it was High Point College. He taught economics, and so that's really how my family made their roots here in North Carolina, and we were raised here and continued to stay here since then. I went to Wake Forest University, where I got a degree in religious studies. I graduated, worked at the university. I got married to my college sweetheart, I guess you could say. And now we have a 10-month-old daughter. So yeah.
Life sounds busy.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I love living in North Carolina. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a couple years after graduating. And the great thing about D.C. is that it's very diverse. I didn't, feel like I had to explain my Muslim identity the way that I have living in North Carolina. But at the same time, people here are so loving and kind and generous. And so I'm really glad to have relocated back to North Carolina. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my experiences with everyone today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your willingness and time to do this. Take it.
Thank you.
Tell us about what you want to talk about.
Sure. So today is September 11th, and for, I would say, many Muslim Americans in particular, it's a very solemn day. It's one that probably changed the course of many of our lives as we know it today. And so I'm just going to share some of my own reflections of my experiences of what's happened since 9/11, 17 years ago now. So I'll start by kind of talking about my own experience after 9/11. I'll also share some of the experiences of my partner and what he had to go through living in New York City. I'll also talk about, our experiences after 9/11 happened, what the country's response was, and how that affected and shaped the Muslim American community as we know it today. And then I'll end on a hopefully more positive note about what we can do going forward and how Christian and Muslim communities can work together for hopefully a better future for everyone. So I titled this slide Never Forget because it's something that I saw in Washington, D.C. in particular on a lot of people's license plates, this, 9/11 never forget. And it's hard because sometimes when I see that, I feel like people don't want to forget the pain that they experienced. And it's hard because that pain was directed towards a particular community. But it's definitely a day I don't think I'll ever forget. I was very young. I was in 4th grade at the time, so probably like 10 or 11. I remember, I'm in class with my peers, and the teachers are very quiet, whispering to one another. And then, as young kids, we have no idea what's going on, but we got released early to go home. And so my dad picks me up. He's listening to NPR as usual. And I just felt, very confused. I had no idea what was going on. I just realized that something serious had happened. And it wasn't until a little later that my parents explained to me that the Twin Towers were attacked by some crazy people. And I didn't understand the implications at that time of what effect it would have on, I guess, the trajectory of my life. So one of the things that happened, my mother, who grew up in Pakistan, she went to school in London. She hadn't really worn the hijab permanently for, I think, any time in her life. And it wasn't until 9/11 happened that she decided, you know what, I want other people to know that I'm actually proud of being Muslim, which was very hard after 9/11 happened. And so she started wearing the hijab, the headscarf that I'm wearing. And I noticed that, as a young kid, especially growing up in North Carolina, there were many white people who lived around us. And I never felt different from my peers and my friends at that time. We're all just young. We're growing up together. We play soccer. We have sleepovers and hang out at each other's homes. But particularly after 9/11 happened, there became almost a very clear divide or difference between me and my peers. Like, you're different. You have brown skin, you're Muslim, you worship differently than us, your culture is different. And so I remember just feeling very self-conscious, like going out to public places, particularly if my mom was wearing more cultural clothing and things like that. For my partner, my husband, he was born in Pakistan, and his family immigrated to the United States when he was about 5 or 6 years old. And when he came here, his parents actually sent him to an Islamic school in New York City, which is very common. They just, it's basically like a Sunday school, but every day kind of thing. You learn to memorize the Quran, and you learn about things that the Prophet did during his lifetime, and you kind of learn to become a better Muslim. And so that had an impact, I think, on how 9/11, I guess, had an effect on him later on. His dad, my father-in-law, was actually working near the Twin Towers at the time. And my mother-in-law recalls to me now that they were freaking out all day long because, nobody could call him, nobody could reach him. They had no idea where he was or if he was safe or alive, and they actually didn't find out anything until he returned home in the evening. He ended up walking from his office all the way down Manhattan to where they lived in Queens. And by car, it can take you over an hour to do that drive. So by foot, I can't imagine how long he was walking for during the day through debris and probably people screaming. And eventually he got home safe and sound somewhere around midnight or a little after that. And like I was saying, my husband, who was going to an Islamic school at the time, they were all sent home early that day as well because their teachers were afraid that somebody would come attack the school or start harassing the students. So one of the after effects of 9/11 has been Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is essentially this, not just a fear, it's very multifaceted the way Islamophobia works, but in its literal definition, it is a fear or a phobia of Islam or people who are Muslim. Islamophobia really enacts itself in a multitude of different ways. On an individual level, it's how you interact with someone, right? Having a hate crime against a Muslim person individually or saying things to them, physically assaulting them. But in the next slide, I'll show how Islamophobia can also be enacted on a state level and how policies are created that are actually Islamophobic and hateful towards Muslims and reinforce a fear of Muslims that makes individual Islamophobia kind of really intense, I guess you could say. So my first experience with Islamophobia was almost immediately after 9/11 when we returned to school. There was a young boy in one of my classes who felt the need to just come up to me and aggressively tell me that it was me and my family who, like, it was your fault. Like, you guys did 9/11. And so at that time, I still had no idea what he was referring to or what he talked about. And I just, remember crying, and teachers got involved and his parents were called. And it's those things that we don't realize, especially as adults, when we say things about other communities, that the young kids, they're listening and they pick up on it. And then they repeat those things. And then the impact that it has on those children later on in their lives is something that we couldn't have anticipated. So it's very important to recognize and think about what it is you're saying, why you think those things, and if you want to pass on those negative feelings towards a whole other generation after us. I also, after 9/11, like I said, I started to notice there was a difference between my peers and I. And a large part of that was because the American identity of Muslims was being questioned a lot. And so I got a lot of comments about, oh, you speak English so well, or people assuming that I couldn't speak English. And then when I opened my mouth, they were kind of surprised, or people telling me that I don't look American simply because of my scarf, even if I was wearing like jeans and a t-shirt. And so those are sort of microaggressions against Muslims when you assume that they're probably not from here. When you say, oh, where are you from? And you don't think that they're going to say, oh, I'm from North Carolina. But, that's the truth. I was also repeatedly, I've been told by so many strangers who just feel the need to come up to me, hey, your dad forces you to wear that. Don't you know you're being oppressed? And then having to explain to them, no, I choose to wear this. I feel like it's a right that I have, especially living in this country where we have freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Those are also microaggressions and forms of Islamophobia. My husband had rocks thrown at him outside of his Islamic school when they would leave in the afternoon. The kids from the public school across the street would throw rocks at them. People in his neighborhood were stabbed to death on their way to the mosque where, they're just trying to go worship. So it really became, and has become, honestly, still today, this sense of not feeling safe in your own country and being constantly looked at as a threat to other people. And I've included some statistics in here about the fact that since Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2016, the incidence of Islamophobia has actually increased, and it's much higher now than it was in 2001. So while I'm talking about 9/11 and the impacts of that, Islamophobia is worse today than it was immediately after 9/11 happened, which is very significant to think about. I, as a Muslim person who, has a social media where I follow lots of other Muslims, am constantly hearing about, multiple times a week, a Muslim person who was assaulted, whose hijab was pulled off, who were verbally attacked, kids at school who are being attacked by their peers and teachers. So it's very bad today. It's worse today than it was immediately after 9/11 happened. So America's response, right? I talked about how Islamophobia can happen on a state or systemic level. So what that means is that the policies that America enacted after 9/11 happened actually perpetuate Islamophobia and are rooted in a fear and hatred of Muslims. So one example of this was the Patriot Act, which gave us the right to surveil Muslims as if they weren't really Americans or weren't allowed the privilege of any sort of privacy. In the case of Guantanamo Bay, Muslims who were suspected of participating in terrorism or plotting or anything like that, even without evidence, they were immediately locked up. There was no due process. There was no trial. They were not given the rights that they deserved as Americans to go through a process. They were simply, locked away. NCERS, which was, instituted in order to have like a database of Muslims. There were lots of no-fly lists after 9/11 happened where the generic names of Muslims were put on lists. And so tons and tons, thousands of innocent people end up getting, put on that list as well because they have the same name. That's also a form of Islamophobia. The Muslim ban that Donald Trump has enacted today is a form of Islamophobia. It is not, a ban against countries that support terrorism. It's a Muslim ban because the countries that are on the list are not even countries where terrorists have come from. Another after effect of 9/11 has been the dehumanization of Muslims abroad. So what has happened is when we went to war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, particularly after 9/11, we started to look at those Muslims in other countries as not as human as us, not deserving of benefit of the doubt, or not deserving of any sort of categorization of being an innocent person or a victim. And what happened is actually tens of thousands of innocent people died in those wars who had nothing to do with any sort of terrorism-related activity. But because we dehumanize them, we don't see that as such a huge loss. We're like, oh, it's a casualty of war, not a big deal. But to us, the people who died in 9/11, those 3,000 people that day who were innocent, right, we take that as a personal attack on us. And so when you retaliate by doing something almost the same as that, we can't imagine that those people are not going to take it as an attack on themselves also. But we don't think of it that way because we've dehumanized them and they don't deserve the same sort of recognition or response or sympathy that we do as Americans. There's also been the over-sensationalization of terrorism in the news, media, TV shows, movies. You had Zero Dark 30, which was supposed to be the recollection of Osama bin Laden being killed. Actually, the day that he was killed, I was a first-year student at Wake Forest. It was, I think after the school year began. And that was another time in history when I don't ever remember feeling so isolated from everyone else around me. Tons of students just cheering and screaming, and you have this feeling of like, obviously I don't like the man and I don't think that he deserved to live, but to celebrate someone's death so strongly almost felt like, in that moment, I felt invisible. Like people just didn't want to know I was there, or that I could have any sort of complex, nuanced feelings about his death. But back to the over sensationalization, right? Perceived Muslim perpetrators receive twice the media as other perpetrators of similar violent incidents. And the rates of coverage when it comes to suspecting a Muslim of terrorism are so much higher on the news than, when the Las Vegas shooting happened, for example. And so it's important to think about when we're watching news, like, why are all the news channels covering this particular incident? Or why did they not cover the other incident as equally? Or why are only certain people being called terrorists and not others? Those are very important questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're taking in our news and media, particularly when it comes to Muslims, because these are forms of Islamophobia, and they end up perpetuating violence and hatred and fear of Muslims, because after those attacks happen, because the news is covering it so much, there end up being a whole slew of attacks against Muslims after that. But no one hears about those things. So the effect on the Muslim American community then becomes a paranoia, a fear, right, that you could be attacked or threatened at any time. So that's happening pretty frequently. I mean, even for myself, right, I've grown up in the South. I love it down here. But when I drive to DC and I'm going down, I'm on US 29 and there's some back roads, I'm not sure how people are going to react when a Muslim woman comes out of her car to pump her gas or buy some food. And so it could be paranoia, but I'm also afraid because I've heard incidents where other people have been attacked verbally or physically just because they look Muslim. There's also a fear of traveling. So I talked about the no-fly list. My husband, for example, had security, like a security stamp put on his boarding pass whenever he traveled. And so he was always searched extra. I remember in middle school, coming back from Pakistan, we went to go visit my grandparents, and my mom was pulled aside at the airport and questioned for hours. And so there is a fear of traveling because you don't know what's going to happen. After the Muslim ban happened, it became much worse because people were afraid that they wouldn't even be allowed back in the country. There were cases of citizens, American citizens who were Muslim, who were not allowed back into the country after the Muslim ban happened, even though they had their American passports. So another effect that I've highlighted is feeling doubly attacked, right? So when I talked about the dehumanization of Muslims abroad, that's part of us, right? Those are our families, our friends' families, our heritage, our ancestors. So you feel attacked as an American because something happened on your soil and you are American, but you also feel attacked as a Muslim and from your cultural heritage because those people were part of the war on terror and those people continued to be attacked. I feel that as a Pakistani Muslim American woman, that Pakistan is looked at as this country that, has terrorism, and I cannot fully, feel my American identity sometimes, and I can't fully feel my Pakistani identity. And so you're just kind of in this limbo stage where all of your identities are being attacked from one side or another. And it's a very hard space to live in. I've worked with a lot of young people who, because of this, they're afraid to openly identify as Muslim. They don't want to embrace their religious identities. They change the pronunciation of their name so that people don't think that they're Muslim. It's hard. It's hard on young people today because they want to find a way to escape from all of the prejudice and Islamophobia that they know other people experience, and they don't want to experience it themselves. I would say the positive effects that it's had on the Muslim American community are more so in line with the fact that Muslims are starting to realize that we need to not necessarily speak out more, because we do speak out when terrorism happens all the time. We're the only community who's asked to defend themselves when attacks like this happen. It's more so we've realized that we need to be much louder. We need to continue to scream and shout and say, all Muslims are not like this. We do not stand for this. We want to do things to help better the country. And so there's a huge push, especially for my parents, for my grandparents, to vote, to speak out against Islamophobia, to not necessarily assimilate, just because for them, assimilation was a survival mechanism. They came to a country that's dealing with lots of race issues, and they wanted to find a way to blend in as much as possible. So they assimilated. They learned how to speak English really well. They wear a lot of Western clothes. They, participate in all the cultural norms. But sometimes it's okay for us not to fully assimilate. It's okay for us to eat our own cultural food and wear our own cultural clothes and participate in things that are not necessarily American. And that's the beauty of this country, is that there are so many immigrants who can still maintain their home country and their homeland while being American and while participating in this culture as well. And so I think a really beautiful thing that has come from this is that the Muslim American community is becoming much more visible. And I'm really glad to be part of that change. 9/11 definitely impacted my life. And I would say that the reason I'm in the field that I am today is because of the effect that 9/11 had on my life. So moving forward to a really hopeful future, I wanted to include some information about Christian and Muslim relations and what we can do together, because there's a lot of great work that's happening among communities, even if we don't hear about it all the time. And so some suggestions I've come up with are to develop relationships with your local mosques, with imams, the religious leaders, plan a visit to a local mosque with your church members, to invite that imam or Muslim, or if there's another Muslim leader in the community. Like, I'm not an imam, but because of my work at Wake Forest, I'm often invited to speak. I spoke at a CBF conference that happened. I've gone to retirement homes in the community. So invite someone in the community to speak, to be able to answer the questions. Hold joint community events with one another. Talk to your Muslim neighbors. Build relationships. So if there's one thing you should know, Muslims love food. We love eating. We have some dietary restrictions every now and then. But if you can ask those questions and find out what those are, maybe have a potluck dinner where you can share different types of food with one another. Educate yourself about Islam from legitimate sources. So going to the Quran, or finding people in the community who can maybe educate you or tell you. There's a lot of nonsense on the internet. So I would ask other Muslims what sources they go to. There's a site that I use called Quran.com that has really great translation of verses in the Quran. Learn about the basic tenets of Islam. So what are the 5 pillars? What are the 6 articles of faith? what do Muslims believe? There's a lot of overlap between Christianity and Islam, actually. So there's one prophet that Muslims believe in that Christians don't, and that's Prophet Muhammad. Other than that, all of the prophets that you believe in, we believe in them too. Volunteer to help a refugee family, or ask your local mosque if there are volunteer efforts you can join or support. So right now I guess not now, but in the past year or two, there have been an influx of refugees, especially to more rural areas in America. And so find out if there's some way that you can help them either learn English or do a food drive, see if they need clothes or any sort of medical help or legal help. Ask your local mosque. The mosque here, one of them here in Winston-Salem, they have a food bank where they collect food and give it out. They've done school drives. They have a free health clinic. So find out what the communities are doing. Or if you have volunteer efforts that you would like them to join in, reach out and ask. I'm sure they would be more than happy. My mosque that my dad is a leader at, we've had blood drives every year on 9/11 to commemorate the lives that were lost. And we usually partner with local churches to collect the blood and help educate one another. So I hope this was informative for anyone who was able to join or listen in or watch later. If you have any questions or anything, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Naijla. I don't have any questions yet. If someone has a question, then please feel free to post that. I do have a couple of questions as we're waiting to see if others do. One is, as you said, we were recording this on September 11th of 2018, 17th anniversary of the actual 9/11 event. So two questions come to my mind with that. For you as a Muslim, and you're also an American, so you're both of these, what happens, like when someone says 9/11, what goes on inside of you, as an American and as a Muslim?
Yeah.
Like what happens when somebody says, well, like this is where I was on 9/11, this is what happened to me. As an American, white, middle-class male, I have one experience, and a Christian. You have a kind of experience.
My first reaction is just, I feel very sad. I feel sad as an American and as a Muslim because I think that both of those communities were hurt tremendously. And so that's my first reaction. And then in my mind, I go back to, what I experienced. I was able to visit the site, and I've been there a few times since, and it's very hard. I mean, you just think about everything that Muslims have had to endure since then and all the pain that it caused Americans and the divisions that exist in our country today because of things like that. And yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. And then a second question with your own role, like you are working with university students. They are 18 to 22, 23, 20, like that. So they were either not yet born or maybe just barely to the world when this happened. So is the experience of a university student different than, or how might it be different, because they weren't around when this actually happened. So what they know are stories from peers that are older, grandparents.
So that's actually been a challenge, particularly the past few years, is that the students that we have today don't really have much recollection of 9/11. They were babies when it happened. And so in the past, we've had like a lot of events or commemoration or a lot of student participation in those kinds of things. And so now you don't really see that as much. For young Muslims, they don't remember 9/11, but they feel the effects of it. They've either been bullied in school or somebody has made terrorist jokes about them. My brother gets that. He was born in 2002, and so he has no memory whatsoever of the events occurring, but he knows that it's had an impact on him because he's dealt with people assuming things about his religious background and his beliefs. And so that's why they're so averse sometimes to openly identifying as Muslim if they can hide it.
Because there's a latent prejudice that's always there.
Yeah.
In the culture.
Yeah. It exists now. I mean,
it's
it's 17 years later, and Donald Trump used Islamophobia and terrorism to help get elected to fearmonger people, and so it still exists. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's gotten much worse. So
yeah, I appreciate your sharing with us some hopeful things too about how churches and mosque, Christians and Muslims can work together. There are some great, I'm looking at your bullet points now, and it's like, yeah, that would be awesome. Like the 9/11 blood drive. What a great way to come together. And in a sense, it's saying like we are all of the same blood. So let's share life with one another rather than fear and death. And so that's a beautiful image to me.
Thank you.
Naijla, so much for sharing with us, for being vulnerable, and for just who you are and what you offer to the Wake Forest community in particular. And thank you for this time that you've given us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.